Hello, Year 11. Hope you're all keeping well and managing to find some normality at this strange time. Hope you're managing to get on Show My Homework as well. Thought you might appreciate a slightly more personal touch today, so I'm going to read the passage for today's comprehension for you. Okay, here goes. So, in this story, Henry suggests to his wife Jenny that she needs some help around the house. Henry said, "You'll have to get some help." He said it in a tone that meant there was to be no discussion. The matter was decided. But nonetheless, Jenny said, "What?" She said it not because she'd not heard, but like a child because she did not want to hear. "You'll have to get some help. I'm tired of this mess." Guiltily, Jenny followed his glance across the smeared table, the children's coats tumbled behind the sofa, and the clutter of toys and newspapers in the corner. "I'd feel awkward having someone polishing my floors and things, Henry. I honestly would." He brushed that objection aside with a snort. Jenny's main worry could not be stated. It was the thought of someone else seeing her household disasters, her failures with the children, her frantic trips to the shops because there was no milk for the baby, no bread, nothing for dinner again. Henry said more kindly, "She could do the worst chores, give you time for the rest." And perhaps that was true. Perhaps if there were someone to wash and hoover and do nappies and all that, perhaps then she would be able to keep the shiny things polished as Henry liked, make nicer food and have ironed shirts ready and available. She said, "What do I do?" He put the paper down and said in a slow and careful voice that meant listen because I'm not going to repeat this. "You write out a card saying that you want a domestic help. Take it along to the corner shop and ask them to put it in the window." 2 days after Jenny's trip to the corner shop, the telephone rang. The caller said she was Mrs. Porch and she would like to call that afternoon. She arrived precisely at the time she'd suggested. Jenny opened the door and Mrs. Porch said, "Mrs. Taylor, I'm Mrs. Porch. About the job." Jenny, confused, found herself blushing and talking too much. And it was Mrs. Porch who led the way into the sitting room. She looked round for somewhere to put her coat, sat down after a moment and said, "They're nice, these houses, aren't they? Have you been here long, Mrs. Taylor?" They talked. She was a pleasant woman. And Jenny began to relax as they toured the house. In the kitchen, Mrs. Porch hung the cloth up to dry, put away the basin. At the same time, she rinsed out a couple of dirty milk bottles and emptied the sink basket. Jenny said, "Oh, please, you mustn't bother." And Mrs. Porch, popping the milk bottles outside the back door, said that she believed in doing things as you went along. "And then you didn't have everything piling up on you, did you?" Upstairs, Jenny saw her look at 3-year-old Emma's unmade bed and the dirty windows, and she grew confused again, hastily picking things up, trying to put clothes in piles. "You can't expect them to clear up, can you, at their age?" said Mrs. Porch. "Bless them." When she left, they'd arranged that she should start on Monday. Jenny could hardly believe her luck. Mrs. Porch's first weeks were positively exciting. She transformed the house within 3 days. The bath and basins gleamed, mounds of dirty clothes disappeared and found later in the airing cupboard, washed and ironed. It was such a nice relationship. There had never been any need to tell Mrs. Porch what to do. She thought of everything. She made sure there were no household shortages, answered the telephone and posted the letters that Jenny had forgotten. When the milkman rang the doorbell during the baby's bath, as he often did, Mrs. Porch called upstairs, "Don't you bother coming down, dear. I'll settle up with him for you, shall I?" "Oh, you're an angel, Mrs. Porch. My purse is in the top drawer of the dresser." The only snag was that for some reason it was working out much more expensive than Jenny had thought. there always seemed to be less money than there should be. Twice she took out her purse in shops and found she had less than she'd thought. And then one day, Jenny found there was a £5 note missing from her purse. A week later it happened again. This time she felt a little thud of shock in her stomach. She'd been trying to be more careful about money. There had been no one in the house all day except herself and Mrs. Porch. 7 days later, another £5 note went missing. It was a Friday, one of Mrs. Porch's days. She felt rather ill and shaky the next day. She tried to avoid Mrs. Porch, but she seemed to be everywhere, talking loudly and cheerfully. Once or twice she looked at Jenny with an odd sharpness. "You feeling all right, dear? You don't look all that good. There's a tummy bug about." Halfway through the morning, the bell rang. Mrs. Porch said, "It's the bread man. I'll just pay him, shall I? I can't seem to find your purse, though, Mrs. Taylor. It's not in the usual place." Jenny said in a strangled voice, "It's all right, Mrs. Porch. I'll do it." She got up hastily, spilling the baby's milk as she did so. "Don't you bother," said Mrs. Porch. "Ah, there it is." She reached forward to take the purse from the table beside Jenny, adding, "Coming, Mr. Binns." "No," said Jenny shrilly. "Please leave it, Mrs. Porch. I'll pay him myself." The baby was crying now, and the bread man ringing the bell again. She left the room hastily. When she came back, Mrs. Porch was soothing the baby. Jenny, her heart thumping horribly, sat down again. Mrs. Porch was looking at her intently. She said slowly, "Is there something wrong with the purse, Mrs. Taylor? Something bothering you?" "No," said Jenny wildly. At least I couldn't bear... There's some sort of mistake, I'm sure. It's just that I felt certain I had..." "I see," said Mrs. Porch. She sounded for a moment subdued, sad almost, but when she spoke again, it was with her old briskness. "If it was anyone else, I'd be angry, Mrs. Taylor. But I've got fond of you. I really have. I like working here. We get on, I thought. So I'm not going to say anything more about it and pretend it never happened. And that's all there is to it. Unless, of course," said Mrs. Porch, "you'd rather I didn't come any more." After a moment, Jenny said, No, honestly, I'm sorry. I expect there's been a mistake." "Then we'll forget about it, right?" Mrs. Porch gathered up the dirty crockery from the table. As she was leaving the room, she turned and said, "And I'd put the purse back in the drawer if I were you, Mrs. Taylor. It'll be a nuisance if I can't find it next time the milkman's wanting his money when you're not about. Won't it?" And Jenny thought about how life had been transformed for her. The house was always clean and dusted. She never ran out of food. Henry had been delighted by the changes, and the children loved Mrs. Porch too. When she was around, they played more and cried less. She said quietly, Yes. All right, Mrs. Porch.